Okay, right. We are heading back to Hezekiah here in chapter 29. And as the thing there indicates, we're looking at worship that follows sanctification, because the big key word last week was sanctification. It kept on popping up all over the place in the first half of the chapter. But then in the last half of the chapter, one of the main words that occurs is worship. So, but before you can worship God, you need to be set apart for God. So last week what we did was we went through and looked at that and looked at some of the men that Hezekiah involved uh, in that process. So we're going to look at the sort of tail end of the section about Hezekiah cleaning the temple and the people that were set aside to do that, and then moving on then to the worship that then takes place in the temple. So, and what we need to realize is that this all happens very, very quickly. This happens, as this chapter tells us, the first day of the first month of the first year of his reign. So, I mean, as soon as he became king, bam, he hit the ground running, so, and that was the big priority. So, so just these particular verses is about continuing to sanctify. And it's not just about setting himself apart, but setting the priests apart, setting the Levites apart, and cleaning up the temple. Because Ahaz and all of what he did just made the temple a complete and utter disaster. So let's initially look at 2 Chronicles 29 and 15 through 19. So it says, and they gathered their brethren, sanctified themselves, and went according to the commandment of the king, and at the words of the Lord, to cleanse the house of the Lord. And then the priests went into the inner part of the house of the Lord to cleanse it, and brought out all the debris that they found in the temple of the Lord to the court of the house of the Lord, and the Levites took it out and carried it to the brook Kidron. And now they began to sanctify on the first day of the first month, and on the 8th day of the month, they came to the vestibule of the Lord, and so they sanctified the house of the Lord in 8 days, and on the 16th day of the first month, they finished. So 16 days, it took to do this. Now, 16 days might sound like a long time, but for the size of this place and the task that was at hand, this was done fast, So, and then they went into King Hezekiah and said, we have cleansed all the house of the Lord and the altar of burnt offerings with all its articles, and the table of showbread with all its articles, and moreover all the articles which King Ahaz in his reign had cast aside in his transgression, we have prepared and sanctified, and there they are before the altar of the Lord. So, so just to highlight a couple of words, especially about that word sanctify, it was all over the place in the first part of the chapter, verses 1 through 14, but here in these handful of verses here, we see the word, the phrase there, sanctified themselves. They began to sanctify, then in verse 17, and so they sanctified the house of the Lord in 8 days. And in verse 19 there, it talks about how they prepared and sanctified. So it's all this idea of setting things apart and making sure that it was not common. This was for God. So, but as I was reading through this passage, I then started to think about, all the things that were done, and how that can speak to us in terms of what we need to do for our own preparation of worship. So, so I entitled this particular slide, The Process of Corporate Cleansing. So, and I think this is a really important thing for church, because I think when people get their heads around this and start implementing this, then you'll see great blessing in the church, but there's so much stupid rubbish that's in the church, whether it's, physical things or things in your mind. So a lot of this can be applied to all levels and all strata of things. So, but the first thing that they did there in verse 15 is that they gathered together, okay, because it says there, and they gathered the brethren, okay. So often it's easy to take a phrase like that and just gloss straight over it, but again, part of Bible study is looking for the action and then setting those different things apart. So when you look at them, no, that's an important aspect, So the first thing that they did as part of this process was that they gathered together. And so it was the need of common purpose and accountability. I find so often within churchdom that there's a lot of lone rangers and there's a lot of people doing their own thing, and they don't want to be accountable to any, to pastors or elders or such. And so I remember running into a guy one time at a church meeting, and Elaine and I were sharing that, and there was a man that came up and gave me his card, and he was some sort of evangelist. And so I asked him, I said, "Oh, so what church do you go to?" "Oh, I don't go to any particular church. I just, I don't think there's any need for that kind of thing. I just go where God leads me." I'm kind of like, no, I don't like that. And he just had an arrogance about him that was just, just unsettling, So I think, now I understand people being abreast of it at church in terms of the mainline denominations and that kind of thing. But I think at the same time, that's where God's people are. You can go and sit somewhere, maybe gather a few people around you of the same kind of mindset, but then all you're doing is creating another group. Yeah. And so it's important to be, God has called me to Banbridge Baptist Church. God has not called me out of it, so I'm here, I'm going to stay here, because that's what God has called me to do. And so you need to look at your own calling and say, is this where God has me? So there is this great importance, I think, of being gathered together, so because when you gather together, especially under the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, well, the common purpose is then to expand his kingdom, promote the gospel, to live a godly life, and then have an accountability that actually helps one another to, get on with it, so, I find, membership in a church very important, because what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to make myself accountable to the leadership and accountable to other people, and so that if I go off the rails or something like that, well, then there's people around me that can gather me back in, So there needs to be a togetherness. And then what they did there, again in verse 15, so it says they gathered their brethren, sanctified themselves. So, 2 words, but very important. So, and they were sanctified together, okay? They were set apart together for the purpose of the things of God. So, so as I say there, the need of an internal, deep and thorough procedure. Remember that the sanctification was the way of the fork. It was the sticking of the tongs of the winnowing fork into the grain and throwing it up in the air, so that you went through the process of separating the wheat from the chaff. And and that was, you didn't just go poof and that was it. You had to do it over and over and over again, because sometimes the cleansing that goes on in our life needs to be a deep and thorough exercise.
Would you mind sanctified? What does that actually? Can you explain that to me? I wasn't here last week, so
right.
What does sanctified mean as a concept?
Sanctification is the process that God has, which is a part of salvation. Okay, and it is the progressive deliverance of yourself from the power of sin in your life. So when you first become a Christian, there's a lot of sin and behavior and mindset that's attached to you. So God needs to stick his fork into you and start tossing you around. and as you know, the wheat is tossed up, the chaff is then blown away, and so you know God is doing a separating exercise so that you will be holy.
Yes, be able to go.
Yeah, so
Okay.
that you will be holy. Third thing here is they went together. Okay, so the motivation from the right source, the authority of God at hand, that was underpinned by the very word of God. So again, if you look at verse 15, and they gathered their brethren, sanctified themselves, and they went according to the commandment of the king at the words of the Lord. So, you know, it wasn't just a gathering together, and it wasn't just okay, let's get ourselves, you know, deeply sorted out and that kind of thing. Well, then you go and you do it. You know, and I always love this phrase, according to something. You know, you find that a lot in the Bible, where there's you know, it's according to what God says. And so God sets up this standard in the with himself to say, look, you follow this. This is what you do. You know, so you know, it's not do whatever you think is best. You know, so have a bit of common sense or something like that. There's actually a lot in the Bible that is actually not common sense. You know, going around the Jericho one time per day and then 7 times on the last day and doing it in silence and then blowing your trumpet. That's not common sense, you know, in terms of the Battle of Jericho, but that was God's way, and that worked, you know.
They were led by
Yeah.
God.
Yes. So, but you know, the commandment of the king here, it says they went according to the commandment of the king. So King Hezekiah was in touch with God. So he was hearing from God. He was the leader that God had put into that position. And so then, you know, it says, and at the words of the Lord, you know, so, you know, this is what is important is God's word. That's what it was part and parcel of him. So, so in a sense, the reason they went together was because there was this motivation from the right source. So that's 3 things out of 1 verse. Okay. And then they went to the right place together. Okay, so there in verse 16. So it said, so they went to cleanse the house of the Lord. In verse 16, then the priest went into the inner part of the house of the Lord to cleanse it and brought out all the dirt. So so what they did is they went to the inside first, not just to the outside. So so to say, their inside then impacts the outside, not the other way around. So because it is an easy thing to do to just adjust external stuff. You know, how often in Northern Ireland do we pass ourselves? You know, that's what they say here. You know, so and I know so many people in my travels and my line of work where there's people that sit and they pass themselves. You know, that, you know, how are you? Fine. They're no more fine than the man in the moon, really. So, but they did this together. Now, we do have to be careful in the sense that, you know, there are things in our personal lives that we don't want to just go and hang out on the laundry line, you know. So I think God gives us wisdom then about the right sort of people that we're going together with. to do the cleanup, because these are people that you trust, because one of the things that's stated in well, particularly the Stars meeting that we run down in Baton Bridge is, what is said here stays here. So because I've been in situations where you can't make it watertight, unfortunately, but there are times when we've made those statements, but then somebody goes and lets loose somewhere and chats, and then that starts to go all over the place, gets misconstrued, misrepresented, and then it comes around and bites you in the back end. So remember when I was in college, I was frustrated about a certain thing, and I told one guy, and I thought, I had his confidence and that kind of thing. Well, he ended up telling somebody that he thought he had confidence, and it's just like, and I remember the guy that I had a bit of frustration about, then called out to me from his door as I was walking along the footpath and says, "Oh, I hear you've been talking about me." And you're just like, yeah, and you knew rightly that you were, but it was like, so, but anyway, it wasn't. I remember another time where I was more on the receiving end of this kind of thing, and I had taken a class in the summertime, and it was one of these classes in college that was required, and so it wasn't the sort of class that I would have taken by choice. It was just a required module and some sort of a history sort of a thing. I'm doing computer science. I'm not interested in history, but except for certain things. So, but anyway, I was up on this roof, cleaning the windows of the woman's house that I was staying at the time. And now, my purpose at this house was only to, there's a 91-year-old woman that was living there. And my deal was you get a free room as long as you stay there at night and you mow the grass. So that was fine. I could cope with that. Now there's about an acre's worth of grass out the back. And they used a two-stroke petrol mower, which was a pain in the back end because you had to go and mix it and do all this silliness, And so, but I was out on this roof because the daughter of this old woman, came into the house and says, "Right, okay, you're sitting there. I want you to clean the windows." I was like, that's not what I'm here to do, I'm sure, but she was a white tornado herself, so I was up on the roof and I was cleaning windows, and then the professor comes walking along the street and has about, I don't know, a dozen and a half people, kids, students, other folk along with him, and he calls out and says, "All right, Woody, she's keeping you busy, isn't she? Just to let you know, you got a B- for the course." It was just a B-. And he kept on then expounding about how sort of I just got a B. So, well, all right, why don't you tell me I just got a C or something like it? It's like, I'm on the roof, and I'm looking down and going, "Thanks, Dr. Matson-Dose, it's great and stuff." So, of course, all these other people heard all this personal information. It's like, "Yes, that's my student up there, and he got a B-." So, yeah, just there. Anyway, so, but where we need to be with ourselves if we're doing things together in terms of a corporate cleansing, well, you need to go to the inside, because that's where it starts, because it says there, then the priest went into the inner part of the house of the Lord to cleanse it. So and then the rubbish was taken away together. There was a complete removal of defilement, and nothing is left intact. So if you continue on to verse 16 there, it says they brought out all the debris that they found in the temple to the court of the house of the Lord. And then the Levites took it out and they carried it to the brook Kidron. So interesting sort of process here, because there were it says the priests went in, to clear out the inner part of the temple. So, and that was really the place that only the priests could go. So, so what they did is they took the stuff, all the garbage, and they shifted it out to the outer court. And then the Levites, see, all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. Okay, so the Levitical tribe was what God had called them to a priesthood, and that was because they stood firm during the whole situation with the golden calf. So when Moses was up on Mount Sinai getting the Ten Commandments, remember Aaron, that said, I don't know where Moses is at, and so the people said, we don't know where he's at. So why don't you get us a bunch of gold earrings and gold this and that, so they put that together. And of course, Aaron, when he was confronted about this, he says, oh, sure, the people told me to do this, and I popped a calf, So, oh, wow, how that happened, and so, he was the one that actually did this, but when judgment was going to befall the people of Israel was who is going to stand on God's behalf. So the Levites came and they stood and they strapped a sword to their side and they executed judgment. And so God recognized that and set them up as the priestly tribe. But so then the Levites, they take it out and they carry it to this brook Kidron. And Kidron, if you remember back to the days of King Asa took idols, and especially the obscene image, as it's talked about, that the queen mother had made for herself. That was the god of the Ashtoreth god. And so, real kinky looking sex symbol that thing was. So Asa then took that and he burned it, and he basically distributed it around the brook Kidron.
Yeah.
So but there's no way to reconstitute something that's been burned and crushed to powder. So I think they did the same kind of thing here. They took it out and they carried it to the brook Kidron. Now it doesn't say the same sort of detail in terms of how it was dealt with, but I think it was a similar thing. So when the bad stuff is taken out of our lives, as we said last week, I know people that take the drink and they set it so carefully at the bottom of the bin so it's not falling over, so that on a bad day it's like, oh boy, I'm finding it a bit tight here, have no money. Oh, fancy that. There's a bottle of, vodka or something like that sitting in the bottom of the bin. And it happens to be standing up, here that doesn't happen because it's completely and utterly dismantled,
And that's what happens to us when God sanctifies us.
Yeah. So that's really all this process, and then the last thing here is that they completed it together. Okay, so in verse 17, it says, now they began to sanctify on the first day of the first month, and on the 8th day of the month, they came to the vestibule of the Lord, and so they sanctified the house of the Lord in 8 days. And on the 16th day, so that's another 8 days, of the first month, they finished. So So the process really was done in a very timely manner. So they didn't fiddle about. So they didn't stand there and I don't know if you've ever gone into your roof space to go and do a clear out, but you find boxes of stuff and old photographs and this and that. It's like, gosh, I haven't seen this thing in so long. And then you're sitting up there and you're looking through things and looking through bits of paper. And and I am absolutely terrible for keeping piles and piles of old statements from, like credit card bills, and all, bank statements and all this stuff. It took me years to actually get to a place where you don't need this, shred. But when Ballyards, when we moved from Ballyards up to Straight Haven, it took me, guts of a week to burn all the documentation that we had from Ballyards that had to do with the residents, and it was not, and it was all forms that had to do with people signing off on medication and all that kind of stuff. You didn't need to keep that, so, but it's really hard to burn paper, believe it or not, so when you had one of those little galvanized steel bins, one of the things that has a little is that a little fisherman's friend or something? Okay.
Can you actually choose that?
Huh? No.
Yes. That's strong stuff, that is.
No, I wouldn't want to sure.
No, you're losing.
Just sort of tuck it in my cheek or something like that, see if the baseball players in there. Oh, anyway, so, but how often we just store up rubbish and stuff.
But we can also do that inside ourselves. That would be past. So it's important to ask God to get rid of it all once and for all, destroy it. It's important.
And sometimes you have to go through nearly a physical exercise like that to get rid of that in your mind. So because sometimes, when we have had experiences, we have images and we it's quite vivid, and it's nearly like we have a gallery in our mind of, we have this painting of this event here. We have this other painting of this other event, and they're all over the place. And often what we do is we go around through the gallery and we take tours. We go, yep, remember that one? Yep, okay. And then you nearly have a good time, going and visiting these things, even though those things were the things that got you into some awful bother, So now I remember talking to a fellow one time, and he talked about taking things down out of the gallery of your mind and basically taking it to the skip, or as we would say in America, the dumpster. Okay. So, and making sure the lorry takes the skip and goes away. Again, because it's easy to go and take a picture down and then walk along with it and say, yes, I'm going to get rid of this thing. And then we kind of stick it there and set it there. Right, that's away. Yep. And then we're backpedaling and then we go look at the thing again. So, so if you go through an exercise in your own head saying, Lord, there's this rubbish in my mind and it's hanging there and I'm looking at it all the time. I'm going to go and I'm going to actually take it down and I'm going to take it and I'm going to ship it away. So sometimes that's a useful thing to do, in a physical way, and now you may have to do it, if you're standing in the middle of your living room or something like that, you may actually go Lord, there is this thing that is right here. Just put your hands up and nearly grab the thing, and it, it's a memory I have of when I was 18 or something, and I was caught up in X, Y, and Z or da, 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 da. So Lord, I'm going to walk this thing. I'm going to take it down. I'm going to put it in the skip, and you're going to visualize then, the man coming and taking it away. So and I think the Lord helps in that process.
It's like a release.
Hmm?
It's a release.
Yes, yeah, because then you're doing what the Bible says, committing your way to the Lord and trust also in Him, as it says in Psalm 37. So, all right, one more here. So, what they did is they reported together. So they provided a thorough report of the cleansing process and demonstrated that the job was done. So verse 18 and 19, it says, and they went into King Hezekiah and said, we have cleansed all the house of the Lord, the altar of the burnt offerings with all of its articles, and the table of the showbread with its articles, and moreover all the articles which King Ahaz in his reign had cast aside in his transgression, we have prepared and sanctified, and there they are before the altar of the Lord. So really the ending process here is, here it is, it's done. We're demonstrating that it's done. We're not just saying that it's done, but we're showing. So I think, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 7 things there out of those handful of verses. But I think, if not for a corporate thing, at least for your own self, you can look at that and say, well, I need to sort of gather myself together here. I need to be sanctified for God. I need to go, and I need to go to the right place, and I need to take the rubbish away, and I need to complete that process in a timely manner, not shuffle my feet and procrastinate. So, because I had been involved with, certain ministries that they shuffle their feet and leave the horse about, and they go, Pastor Taylor's pet peeve word is, oh, it's ongoing. So we're having sort of a joke about that, but so if you say to Pastor Taylor, oh, what he says that ongoing is a bad word, he'll go, you're right. So now, where it then goes from here in verses 20 and following is worship then takes place. So the sanctification, the cleaning up process has happened, and now we're going to look at the next 10 verses or so. So then King Hezekiah rose early, gathered the rulers of the city, went up to the house of the Lord, and they brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, 7 male goats for a sin offering for the kingdom and for the sanctuary and for Judah. And they commanded the priests, the sons of Aaron, to offer them on the altar of the Lord. So they killed the bulls, and the priests received the blood and sprinkled it on the altar. Likewise, they killed the rams and sprinkled blood on the altar. And they also killed the lambs and sprinkled blood on the altar. And they also brought out the male goats for the sin offering before the king and the assembly, and they laid their hands on them. And the priests killed them, and they presented their blood on the altar as a sin offering to make atonement for all Israel. For the king commanded that the burnt offering and the sin offering be made for all Israel, which I actually find kind of interesting, because King Hezekiah here is not just strictly interested in the southern kingdom. He is concerned about, as it were, sort of national unity. So because there's 10 tribes up to the north that now have been taken into captivity by Assyria, and there's a remnant left, and he wants to incorporate them. So, and he stationed. So something was thinking of. Yep, had to crunch it. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals with stringed instruments and with harps, according to the commandment of David, of Gad, the king's seer, Nathan the prophet. These are all contemporaries of David. For thus was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. And the Levites stood with the instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. And then Hezekiah commanded them to offer the burnt offerings on the altar. And when the burnt offering began, they sang, they began the song of the Lord also began with the trumpets and with the instruments of David, king of Israel. And so all the assembly worshipped, the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded, and all this continued until the burnt offering was finished. And when they had finished offering, the king and all who were present with him bowed and worshipped. Moreover, King Hezekiah and the leaders commanded the Levites to sing praises to the Lord with the words of David and of Asaph the seer, and they sang praises with gladness, and they bowed their heads and worshipped. Okay. So, and obviously I've highlighted, the word worship in there because this is the main activity. So now, when it talks about worship in the Bible, that is a very, very visual thing. It's not just bowing the knee. It's not looking like you're bowing down. In that sense, you are flat on your face and you are on the ground. So, and that's what worship is being prostrate before God. So, because when you're in that position, that is the most vulnerable position that you could ever be in. So, but that's where God wants you. So, and you can see some of the words that are associated with that. So all the assembly worshiped, the singers sang, the trumpets sounded. That's probably where we get some of our idea that worship is associated with music. And when they finished the offerings and all that kind of stuff, the king, all who were present with him, bowed and worshipped. And then at the end there, they all sang praises with gladness, and they bowed their heads and worshiped. So there's this is not drudgery. This is excitement. This is, but they know their position before God. They need to be humble before God. This is what God deserves. And John 4, sorry.
The Bible talks a lot about trumpets. Even, in songs that, the singer the trumpet sounded. And,
yes.
And the harps too, but the trumpets.
Yes, well, the trumpet was a heralding thing. The trumpet was a particular animal's horn, and basically they blew out of it, and it was a rather shrieky sort of sound, but it was quite loud, quite bugly, so it was quite a my dad will remember here when he used to go hunt for elk. I remember he had an elk horn. This was not an antler or anything like that, but it was a special horn that you used in order to attract elk to come in. So it was like an elk bugle, and I remember he blew this thing, and I mean the whole neighborhood could hear it. It was just a loud thing. But you needed that in the woods, if you were going to go and try to bring some of the bucks, about, because if you blew your elk bugle, then all the other male elk were all like, "What's happening here, boys? There's somebody in my territory." But here, the trumpets that are sounded are to really bring people together. This is the call to worship, call to come to God. So, and then the next sort of handful of verses, which I think takes us down to the end of the chapter, is it? Yeah. Okay. So then Hezekiah answered and said, now that you've consecrated yourselves, now notice these are more in blue here, these sanctified sort of words. Now that you have consecrated yourselves to the Lord, come near and bring sacrifices and thank offerings into the house of the Lord. So the assembly brought in sacrifices and thank offerings, as many as were of a willing heart brought burnt offerings. And the number of the burnt offerings which the assembly brought were 70 bulls, 100 rams, 200 lambs. All these were for burnt offering to the Lord. And the consecrated things were 600 bulls and 300 600 bulls and 3,000 sheep. Okay, language right here. But the priests were too few, so that they could not skin all the burnt offerings. Therefore, their brethren, the Levites, helped them until the work was ended, until the other priests had sanctified themselves. For the Levites were more diligent in sanctifying themselves than the priests, which was kind of interesting. And then the burnt offerings were in abundance, with the fact that the peace offerings and with the drink offerings for every burnt offering. So the service of the house of the Lord was set in order. And then Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced that God had prepared the people, since the events took place so suddenly. So now let's just draw out a few bits and pieces out of this. And so I entitled this sort of the godly interests of Hezekiah, because now that these things are in place, there are certain things that he then does or instigates. And the first thing is he is rising early. So in verse 20 there, it says, and then King Hezekiah rose early. So he didn't sleep in. This was an immensely important day here. And because of when this is taking place, now we'll get into the next chapter when the Passover is being celebrated. It actually is getting celebrated a month late. So I think, and there is provision for doing that in the scriptures, for celebrating the Passover a month late. So, but Hezekiah is very, very keen to do this straight away. So, and I think there's a bit of mileage in thinking about our own quiet time before God, and that I think needs to be done in the morning. Now, some of us may say, okay, I'm not a morning person. Some people have their quiet times at the end of the day, or they may have them in the middle of the day, or something like, where they're a bit more at the game, or something like that. Okay, understand that. But I think it is very important to start the day with God.
Yes.
So even though you might be a late riser or something like that, I do know people that they have to drag out of bed.
It's important to acknowledge God.
Yeah, yes, even though that may not be your main time for God, you still have that time where you say, Lord, I'm committing this day to you. When Elaine and I have breakfast together, well, before we have breakfast, we have our respective quiet times, and then when we come together and get our coffee, and we actually try to stage all this from the night before, so that the cereal's out, covered over, all coffee accoutrements are all stationed and in place and all this, so that when we're getting up in the morning, we're not belabored with a bunch of process, because the flaming dog and the cat, they demand attention, in the morning, and unfortunately you can't prep their stuff, because they're all looking at you like, any chance, so anyway, so you have to deal with that. So I have to the cat story and the dog story and all this stuff. So anyway, but the more that's in place, that's not distracting you, then the more time then you have before God. So, so then when we come together and hit the kettle and all that kind of stuff, then Elaine and I would have a little bit of a prayer time, just standing there in the kitchen and committing our way to the Lord, you know, in those terms. So, and then we sit down and have breakfast, and then she's at the door, and then wait with the dog. So, it's always like a dog. So.
I couldn't concentrate without my breakfast.
Would you not?
I have to have breakfast before I can speak.
Yes.
I would go by walk and then I can go and do my quiet time.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Get the stupid stuff of the day in my head and.
Yeah. Well, you know, and that's what works. You know,
That works for me.
yeah, and I think that's what's important is finding what.
Now, when I was teaching, fair enough, I would have got up a little bit earlier,
Mhm.
but I also had to get breakfast first.
Yes.
For the quiet time,
Yeah.
for the go to school.
Mhm.
But I always had to have my breakfast. Without my, I just,
Mhm.
I'm all over the place.
I remember there was a man in college I went to Geneva. He was the vice president of academic affairs. So you had the president of the college, and then you had VPs of all various departments, but he was in charge basically of faculty. And he was one of the most godly men I had ever met in my life, you know, and he used to be where his training and professorship was originally was in pharmaceuticals. And this guy, you know, was trained up and all that kind of thing. But he felt led of God to come to this private college and you know, and he would come in early in the morning. He would come in at 6:30, and he would sit in his office and have his quiet time, you know, and then go down to the canteen afterwards and get his breakfast, and then come back up to the office and start at, you know, 8 or, you know, whatever the time was. But because the working day over in America tends to start a lot earlier. People, you know, you do hear the 9 to 5 kind of thing, but there is a lot of sort of 8 to 4 sort of stuff that goes on. But I remember going to see him, and he was very personable with the students, and but he demonstrated godliness. He was just a man that was just full of the Holy Spirit and full of the things of God. And I remember going in to see him, and he says, "Uncle, it's good to see you." And he came out from behind his desk, and then he sat down with you. You know, he didn't sit behind his desk and talk to you as, you know, there, because where there's a desk, there's a separation. You know, it's like, you know, I'm the academic, I'm the professor, I'm the VP or whatever, and you're the peon. You know, but he never made anybody feel like that. He always came out from behind his desk and sat with you, you know, and he prayed with you. You know, so you know, and that's a wonderful thing, you know, in a college, you know. So you know, because America has quite a number of Christian universities, but I could count on one hand how many professors would say, "Well, sure, let's pray about this." You know, so it was a tremendous man. You know, so just his name was Jim Wilkins. You know, I just had an awful lot of time for him. You know, because he just oozed godliness. You know, and yeah, and you wanted to be around that. You know, it was almost like, gosh, all I want to do is just sit in Dr. Wilkins' office. You know, because he just gives you the time of day. You know, so
I have no idea how, I would have to be in school about an hour before it started. I could never understand teachers rushing at the last moment. I have to be prepared. And I'd like to be in church here then. And we used to be a joke at home. So say, where was Lord? I used to say, we're stuck at the cinema, we're going to. And that used to be the joke at home. Mum, Jonathan, and the rest, I'm not going to the cinema. But I, you know, I couldn't run into church at the last moment.
Yes, because you're scatterbrained and, you know.
I have to get in there and get myself settled. Different people are different, or I can understand that, but I need to get myself settled. Okay, and down and get my thought process settled.
yeah. So anyway, there's mileage to rising early. So Hezekiah was like that. And then there was the working together, because it says there when Hezekiah rose early and gathered the rulers of the city and went up to the house of the Lord. And so his gathering there is sort of a bit like, you know, in verse 15 there, where they gathered their brethren. You know, here King Hezekiah is gathering the rulers of the city. It's like, okay, we're going to go and we're going to do this together. We're going to work together. You know, so and you know, as they say, what do they say about working together? You know, it's you know, if you're working on your own, you get a certain amount of work done. But then if you're working, you know, if there's two of you doing it together, you know, you get, you know, like 3-4 people's work done. You know, so so he understood the importance of that kind of thing. And then there was this orderly worship in verse 21 to 24. It says, and they brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, and and they, you know, went through all that procedure. But suffice to say, it was orderly. Okay, so they did this, you know, according to the book. They didn't do it just as they felt or as they thought or whatever. It was all according to what God was saying, and it was properly ordered.
There's numbers, how many?
Yes.
How many?
Yeah.
So that would have been to.
Yeah, now it's interesting, like in verse 21, it talks about 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, 7 male goats. You know, and 7 in the Bible is seen as the number of God. It's the number of perfection. If you remember when we were talking about Hebrew numbers, you know, 6 was generally the number of man. It was usually associated with, you know, sin and that kind of thing. But the 7th letter, which was Zayin, you know, had a cap on its head, you know, and so Vav, which was the 6th letter, that was the nailed man. Remember, that was a picture of a nail, and it was about a nailed man, which you know, was in a sense the Lord Jesus Christ, then identifying with us. But then when Jesus went to the cross, did what he needed to do, he then became the crowned man. And so the 7th letter, Zayin, was a Vav with a big cap on it, and it looked like a crown. So that was the crowned man. So here we have a complete worship that is going on. And then there was this national unity that I had mentioned before, because in verse 24 there, it says, for the king commanded that the burnt offering and the sin offering be made for all Israel. You know, so and we'll see when we come up to the Passover in the next chapter, there's a lot of people that are coming down from the northern tribes, you know, because they see the blessing that's taking place, and their poor heads are just completely scrambled because half of their families have been taken into captivity, and so they're left. You know, it's a bit like the Ukraine. You know, it's you know, there's people that are left in this part of the world completely and utterly devastated, and so they're seeing what's happening down south, and Hezekiah wants them to participate in that. So they, you know, it's not just, oh well, you're a bunch of screw ups up there because of your sin, so stuff you. We're going to go and do our thing. No, he's not interested in that. He's like, no, come on down. You know, let's worship together.
So here's twice in the verse for all this week. Here's actually twice.
That's right. Yep. So
it's important.
Yep, for atonement for all Israel, and then at the end of that verse, made for all Israel. Yeah. So there's a, see, this was something that Hezekiah, I think, really understood, where a lot of the other kings didn't get it, in terms of the importance that God's people was all of Israel, not, yes, the ones that are up north left God, they sinned, they did, all that sort of thing, but God wasn't done with them. God didn't just, send them out next week, and that was the end of it. So, and then there was this worshiping together. So verse 25 to 30 was, I stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and stringed instruments and harps, and how they, went by the commandment of David, and all those different things. But then it says there in verse 31, then Hezekiah answered, I'm sorry, that's not down at the end of that verse, it says, and many were of a willing heart that brought the burnt offerings. So, so not only were they doing it together because of the command of God, but they were doing it because they were willing to do. This was the right thing to do. And then they solved problems together. In verse 34, there is the situation where it says, but the priests were too few, so that they could not skin all the burnt offerings, and therefore their brethren, the Levites, helped them until the work had ended, until the other priests had sanctified themselves, for the Levites were more diligent in sanctifying themselves than the priests. So, so it's interesting that the priests, for whatever reason, there was not enough of them, and so their brethren, the Levites, because all priests are Levites, their other family members says, well, okay, we'll get in there and muck in with you and get this sorted. So and they but they knew about the how important the sanctification was. So you have those, you're coming back to those words. So worship is going on, but sanctification is still the overarching thing, because sanctification in the Christian life always takes place. So you'll in this life you'll never arrive. Okay, you'll never get to that point where, oh, okay, now I'm completely and utterly sorted out here. No, that doesn't happen until you get to heaven. And some people are frustrated with that because they believe that I'll come to Christ, that will sort things out. Yes, it does. It justifies you in the sense that it immediately delivers you from the penalty of sin. So that's sorted, okay? But the process of removing you from the power of sin in your life takes time. And so for some people, it takes, depending on what their circumstances are in their situations, it could take a day or it could take 10 years. So and that's how it takes place. That's how it happens. Everybody is different in that sense. Everybody's sanctification story and sanctification journey is different. Now, I would say that if you're looking at somebody who says they're a Christian and they're stuck and they're not really having much of an appetite about changing, then I would wonder about their salvation.
Yes.
Okay. But if there is at least some sort of appetite for moving in the right direction, even though it's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, kind of, doing that kind of thing. I mean, I sit with guys that are professing Christians, and there are some that I basically said, you know what, you're not going anywhere. Give me a ring when you're ready, kind of thing. Fill your boots and drink away. But then there's other people I will sit with, and I go, you know what, I see progress, so I'll hang in there with you. Not that I'm the be all and end all, but you do have to sort of give them encouragement and say, look, you're you're doing the right thing. You're trying to make the right choice. Let's continue to bring God, because it talks about the washing of the water of the word. And Jesus says you're already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. So the word of God is a cleansing agent, and you just have to constantly bring the word of God into you to keep you cleaned up. Has anybody only ever taken one shower and that was it? So just for those on the Zoom here, Pelly has stated that he's only ever taken one shower. So
You could be walking somebody next door. You could be walking somebody.
yeah, walk about. So, but no, we don't take one shower. We do this, every day or every other day or every week, whatever your pattern of thing is. And then there was a not only orderly worship, as the third thing would say, but there was the orderly service, because there in verse 35, it says also the burnt offerings were in abundance with the fat and peace offerings and with the drink offerings of every burnt offering. So the service of the house of the Lord was set in order. So so there was, Hezekiah was very, very keen on this. And then there was, at the end here, the rejoicing together. It says, then Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced that God had prepared the people since the events took place so suddenly. So there was a real importance for this idea of joy. So,
when you see where he came from and you see a son after him, he's something else.
Would you compare him to King David?
Well, and that's how he is compared. He says he because at the beginning of that chapter, it says he did what was right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father David had done. So,
When you see his son's reign is dreadful, and then his son repents.
Yeah. Oh, you're talking about
Manasseh. It's some turnaround.
Yeah.
When you start to read.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting when we get that one.
Quite blessed the people must have been for this king to be the way he is, because previous kings were absolute disaster and cruel, and but for the people here, like all of that worked. They were all sanctified, and and then they could come together, they could work together.
Yeah.
And it worked.
It worked, yes, and it always does.
Yeah.
So when you do, as Hudson Taylor once said, God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. So and
Blessings in that.
yeah. So but if you try to shortcut it, or any of those kinds of things, you'll end up with and then you're standing there with your hands in your pocket going, so what happened there? I thought I was doing all right, but I know so many Christian organizations that cut corners, and they use the excuse of, oh, we don't have enough money, or we don't have this or that or whatever, it's like, no, you have to do things according to the book.
Just read that.
So, oh, one more. Sorry, I thought there was. I thought that was it. Okay, so it was recognizing that God was the one doing this, because it did say that Hezekiah recognized that God was the one that was pushing this forward.
And that's very important to do.
Yeah. So. Because I think if you can understand and recognize that God, as it says in Philippians 2:13, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do his good pleasure. So, what a wonderful thing to think that God works in you.
Yeah. It's a privilege.
Yeah. So, and that helps to keep you right. It keeps you on the right track. Because if you think, oh, I did something cute, or I did something nifty, that got me into this situation. And we do this all the time because we try to scheme, we try to finagle things, we try to, well, if I say such and such to so and so, then maybe they might acquiesce and do this, that, the other thing, and I'm guilty of that kind of thing, so I remember years ago I used to I was speaking at a Star State in Port Down, and Arthur was there, and Arthur Williams, and no, he wasn't there. Sorry, no, I was, no, he wasn't there. But what I tended to do back then is I would sort of go around people and say, so that wasn't really a great meeting, was it?
Mhm.
And they would go, oh, but it was great, you did really well, or something like this, and all that was me fishing for compliments, and so I told Arthur this story. I says, Arthur, this is what I do, because it was at the time, when I would do that kind of thing, he would say, right, well, I will make sure that I will never compliment you. I was just like, ooh, boy, that's stiff, So, but he said that for my good,
Yes.
So, let's go back to where we started.
No.
So,
Yeah.
Was this really a genuine without, or was it skin deep? Because I'm reading here, I went back to Kings,
mhm,
and after the Babylonian Anthony's, Isaiah said, hear the word of the Lord, the days are coming, but all what is in your house and that which is in your fathers have stored up shall be carried to Babylon. Were they genuine with the people, or were they just because the king?
Well, as we'll see at the end of Chronicles, there were certain things that the Israelites never did, that were the proper commandments that they were supposed to adhere to, and there were things that they just didn't bother doing. So there were some things that they were doing right, and but God is keen that the entirety of the word is followed, and so there were things that they didn't do. So I'm sure that was in a sense probably discouraging to the likes of Hezekiah.
I have you'll hear me talk often over every show. His book stops with the history of the Old Testament, stops with them carried away, and his very last sentence always sort of stuck in my mind. Then the land had its Sabbath rests.
Yep.
Mhm.
That's all stuck with me. Then the land had its Sabbath. They were carried away to the number.
Yep, and that's in chapter 36 there, I think verse 21, that particular verse. And and that is a linchpin verse because that is referring to a practice called Shemitah, which was to you tilled your fields for 6 years, and then you let them sit for a year. So that was the 7th year.
Yeah.
That was the Sabbath year. And but God would bless your 6th year so that you had actually three years worth of crops that would then carry you through the Sabbath year, or that 6th year, the Sabbath year, and then into the 1st year, because you wouldn't get your crops until the end of that season. Okay. So,
yes.
But the Jews never practiced that. So the reason for 70 years of captivity was so the land could get its rest, because the Jews didn't do it for 490 years.
Yes. Makes sense.
So that's why so that the land might have its rest.
Yeah.
And that's it's interesting that that was a verse that was highlighted to you, because that's a really easy one to gloss over.
Yes.
If you're just reading through the Bible and you read that and go, whatever. So, and And it wasn't until I was reading, I was actually going through a book called the Torah for Christians, and I was going through a year's worth of study of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Exodus book, and so I highlighted that particular thing, but I've never seen this before.
The very last sentence of that issue, he finished
Yeah.
the land had a Sabbath rest.
Yeah.
And that really, that's just the way he did it. He was a Jew converted to Christianity.
Yes, so I just jumped out, yeah.
Now he's dead over 100 years.
But still, that
Oh.
stays with you.
And a lot of his history